What are your general impressions of what you're seeing taking place in and around that country right now?
Well, certainly that's a great way to start. I guess surprise and heartbreak and shock of the murder of Israeli civilians, 800 plus, the kidnapping of 150 Israelis into the Gaza Strip, the response in Gaza that has in turn killed 600 Palestinians, the increase of the blockade, just an escalation in violence that is a heartbreak and a surprise, but also the outcome of continued hostilities and escalation on both through the Netanyahu government and also Hamas and the current government in Gaza. So certainly a heartbreaking escalation to current tensions.
In terms of Hamas, I think there's a little bit of confusion between who Hamas is in just generality versus
Right.
just your general Palestinian citizens that go about their daily life. They do their thing just like you and me, and they have families and they have children.
Right.
Who is Hamas?
Hamas starts in the late 1980s. It's an Islamic resistance movement committed to the liberation of Palestine, though it is an Islamist movement that sees a natural connection between Islam and politics. They have an armed wing, a violent terrorist organization associated with them, though Hamas came to power democratically in an election in 2006. So they are the representative government of Gaza, which is different than the Palestinian Authority, which is a secular political party that controls the West Bank. And so Palestinian communities are divided across the West Bank and in Gaza. And of course, they had their own political rivalries between Hamas and Palestinian Authority. And
How
so
does this further,
there's internal distinctions there as well.
well, how does this further complicate things there just in the region?
Well, it complicates the Palestinian Authority's position vis-a-vis the Israeli government. They're the officially recognized negotiation partner. Though Mahmoud Abbas has failed to hold elections in over a decade, he understands that if the Palestinian people in the West Bank were to have elections, he would lose power. And so the Hamas attacks over the weekend make the Palestinian Authority look weak and ineffective, a lack of legitimacy. It undermines the legitimacy of Hamas control in Gaza, and it prevents a stable negotiating partner either within the Netanyahu government or the political authorities in the West Bank and Gaza. It prevents any discussion about a one-state solution, a two-state solution, how to move beyond the status quo.
Austin, at this point, is it fair to call this a war?
Yeah, it's a resumption of conflict and hostilities that's been going on since at least 2006 or 2014. The Netanyahu government declared war. It's mobilized over 360,000 reservists. That's the largest mobilization of Israeli reservists since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, about 50 years ago this weekend. And so the Israeli government is prepared not only to continue airstrikes on Gaza, but perhaps to launch a ground invasion in the coming weeks.
How do other extremist groups fall into play here? I know that when I was speaking with, obviously, Mr. Giora yesterday, he mentioned
Right.
Hezbollah, of course, coming out of Lebanon and the backing from Iran. Where does all of that fit in the mix? Because it's not just Gaza. It's now, it seems like Israel is under attack from a number of different angles.
Well, that's an excellent question. And it's important to keep in mind how this conflict is not only an internal conflict within Israeli or Palestinian society, it's also a regional conflict. And so when we talk about Hamas, Hamas has financial and political support from Gulf states like Qatar, and has support from Turkey and also Iran in terms of intelligence support, arms, munitions, etc. And it also has a cooperation or the tacit approval of Hezbollah, which is an insurgent movement in southern Lebanon that gets support from Iran that has attacked Israel from the north as well. And so it's not only insurgent groups attacking both Israeli and Palestinian civilians for that matter, it's also the support of foreign proxies, which makes any peace settlement a multinational effort.
Austin, here in 2023, how volatile is the Middle East region just in general right now?
Well, I once had a colleague that I worked for in Washington who said that the Middle East is a region where lots happen and very little changes. And I think that's an apt summary of what we see. Following from the Trump administration, also currently with the Biden administration, efforts to expand normalization with the state of Israel through the Abraham Accords. These attacks over the weekend occur in the context of increasing normalization between Saudi and Israel. I think those talks will be on hold for now. We've also seen rapprochement or a detente between Iran and Saudi, two regional competitors in the Persian Gulf. And so I think there's lots of instability. These attacks and the current tension are the natural consequence of Israeli-Palestinian politics for at least the last 60 years, if not longer. And these problems will persist regardless of regional dynamics. We would have seen these attacks regardless of an Israeli-Saudi peace deal. And the solution lies as much in the Israeli and Palestinian governments as it does regional actors as well.
How strong are these extreme groups? Like, how deep do they run in terms of what harm they can inflict in what they do? I know that obviously this was a very heartbreaking way to enter the conflict, as it seems most recently with the music festival and kind of going after innocent civilians in that circumstance. But how deep do their resources run?
It's hard to say. There's various estimates. I think what we know at this point is that the Americans, the Israelis, and also regional actors were surprised at the capabilities and tactics of Hamas. We know they receive financial support from Iran, the same with Hezbollah. Wall Street Journal is reporting that Iran had an active role to play in the planning of these attacks. In my mind, I'm going to remain agnostic to that point. I think it's still yet to be substantiated. But we know that they receive financial support. And what we've seen with Hamas is increasing adaptation to Israeli defenses. And so the Israelis, with their Iron Dome system, are able to shoot down rockets from Gaza. So what Hamas does is they use rockets as an initial salvo and then send in forces from the air and ground to then terrorize and murder civilians. And so we see strategic adaptation alongside that. And I think the national security establishment in the United States, in Europe, and Israel now are reassessing their threat assessments of Hamas and Hezbollah in light of this. We're certainly reevaluating the effectiveness and reputation of the IDF and Israeli intelligence, traditionally considered really excellent in terms of combat effectiveness. This has changed our assessment of their capabilities.
Austin, where does the United States fit into all of this?
Well, the Biden administration, through Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has come out in support of Israel. We've provided military and political support, though this has typically been the position in the United States since the Cold War, and it's increasingly ineffective in terms of dealing with the political situation on the ground. Unfortunately, the United States has a vested interest in the politics of the Middle East, and especially Israel and Palestine, though we're not a disinterested actor. And so we fail to have legitimacy among the Arab Street in particular. And so any negotiated peace or ceasefire will have to include certainly Egypt, Israel, Palestine, perhaps Jordan, and regional states moving forward.
You say there's a vested interest. Why? Why do we have such an interest in what's happening there?
So U.S. foreign policy interests in the region are pretty straightforward. We've supported Israel since its creation in 1948 as a democratic state in the Middle East. We value political and stability in terms of the security architecture of the region. The Israelis have been a valuable partner in counterterrorism efforts, particularly since 9/11. And of course, regional dimensions affect energy markets that have a direct implication for Europe and the United States in terms of the cost of energy, oil and natural gas specifically. And so the United States has security interests, we have economic interests, and we have interests with respect to liberal democratic values, how we promote our values in the region writ large.
How does this war fit into history in terms of casualty and devastation in your eyes and what you've seen just in the past few days?
Right. So it's significant that the current war comes on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War that happens in October 1963, where the Israeli government is caught by surprise by the Syrians and Egyptians. And over the course of many weeks, fights those Arab armies to a draw. And it's a typical situation where it is a military victory, but a political defeat, much like the American experience in Vietnam, where you can win the war on the ground and lose the politics. And so since that time, and particularly since the failure of the Oslo Accords in the early 90s, we've seen continual military incursions into Gaza. The Israeli government decided to leave Gaza in 2005, but now with the blockade, Gaza is in effect an open-air prison. And so rather than having ground invasions by the Israeli military, we've had airstrikes, rocket volleys from Hamas into Israel, and then in response, airstrikes that kill militants and also kill innocent civilians. And so it's been a tit for tat where either side is punishing civilians for the political actions of their representatives. And it's a heartbreaking cycle.
So at the end of the day, this is all politically rooted.
It's politically rooted. Like I tell my students, when you talk about Israel-Palestine, it is not a 5,000-year-old conflict that goes back to religion and Father Abraham and Islam. It's a 100-year-old conflict that actually goes back to the 1923 as well. When we think about the current dynamics in Gaza, these are all dynamics that have emerged since the early 1990s. And so there's more relevant history in the last 30 or 40 years than going back several hundred. Certainly religious ideology's importance and motivation for people's politics and what matters to them. Though I would say it's secondary. It's primarily a conflict over territory and where you draw borders between Israel and Palestine.
Austin, how should people here in Utah and really in the United States be consuming this? What do you think the main takeaway should be when you see a new update come out about a new, siege of air raids or whatever? I mean, or if ground forces move in eventually, what is the general way that people here, hundreds and thousands of miles away, should be consuming this as they watch it unfold?
I think that there's a twofold response. The first is that all news is local. And in fact, not only in Salt Lake, but here in Cache Valley, we have dozens of community members that are Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza. We have Israeli American faculty here at Utah State University. So I think the first impulse is to reach out to your friends and neighbors and colleagues and ask them how they're doing, right? That is directly within our sphere of influence and responsibility to care for our neighbors, especially now that we have Palestinians and Israelis here in Utah. The second is to be very careful about how you cultivate your news sources. What we've seen in the last several years, starting with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and now in Israel, Gaza, a flood of mass information on social media, particularly outlets like Twitter, or what was formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram, where it's very difficult for the average layperson to get an accurate understanding of what's going on. And so I tell my students to read Al Jazeera as much as they read the Jerusalem Times or Times of Israel. There's no neutral perspective on this conflict, though some are more reliable than others. Just because it's subjective doesn't mean it's totally morally relativistic. So I think that the twofold response: care for your neighbors and care about the news that you read.